Well, good morning and welcome to OpenUK's first Thought Leadership Day. I'm Amanda Brock, I'm the CEO at OpenUK, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. I'd like to start by going through a few items of housekeeping, and I have a couple of slides for you on that. So, we have a visitor safety briefing that I've been asked to take you through. And in the event, unlikely event, I hope, of a continuous alarm, please will you go to the evacuation marshals will direct you, in fact, to the evacuation points. Don't collect your personal belongings. Don't do anything stupid. Don't worry about iPads, keypads, whatever it is you happen to have with you. Just leave the building. We don't expect this to happen, so please don't worry. There's a map here of the evacuation point. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to memorize that. There'll be a competition for it later. And for those of you visiting from the US, the emergency services here are 999 on the local number, and there is also an 0207, I can't read that from this distance, number, which you can dial for emergency medical services in the building. But we do have a number of people around the event today. We have Jill working with us, who is our new event producer, and Michelle, who is our operations support manager. So if you need to speak to anybody or ask questions through the course of the day, please go to them. So coming back to the day and the contents of the day, I'm really grateful to Bristow's law firm. Toby Crick, who is a member of our legal and policy group, has been a stalwart in supporting our work from day one. So thank you very much, Toby, for hosting us in this amazing venue. I believe this is normally used by the chairman of Unilever, and we had to shift the date, as you know, because of the Queen's funeral. And in that shift, we had this room organised, and then we got a message saying the chairman needed the room. So for all of you being here today to talk about open source, we've had to bump the chairman of Unilever from his private auditorium. So we're very, very grateful to Bristow's. I don't quite know how they did that. And to OpenSSF, who have organised this event in collaboration with us, and to Jim Zemlin, the Linux Foundation Executive Director. As you probably all know, OpenSSF sits within the Linux Foundation, and it's great to have all of you here today. So I think that I've covered, one last thing, speakers who are not here. Because of that shift from 17th of October, we lost a few of our speakers. And some of those are speakers who were very important to me. We were to have Atlantic Council here, which is disappointing. We were also to have Salim Avan, who is the Governance and Policy Director at the UN. Salim was coming until last week. He was going to make a special trip, but he has a family health issue, which means he's had to stay. He has, however, committed to work with us going forwards. And the same, with slightly different circumstances, is true of Mehul Sivrastrata, who is the cyber correspondent at the Financial Times. And Mehul was going to keynote today, but Mehul is in Ukraine still and won't get back till tomorrow. So I'm hoping he's back safely, but he's committed to continue to work with us through into the spring and our next event. So I thought I would start by contextualizing what we're all doing here today. Just have a bit of a think about why we're here. A few of you worked with me 15 years ago at Canonical. Anybody who doesn't know, Canonical was then, and probably still is, one of the biggest, but it was then the biggest open source organisation in Europe. And we had quite a difficult task because we were distributing open source software and negotiating contracts with the private and public sector. I was very lucky that I was asked to join an advisory board for the public sector with the Cabinet Office. And that was at the request of Liam Maxwell, the then CTO at the Cabinet Office, who was working for Francis Maud. And that Cabinet Office advisory helped the UK to frame an open first strategy that was one of the first anywhere in the world. It was absolutely world leading. And that was released in 2011. And then in 2012, I believe, we saw GDS, Government Digital Services, something that's been emulated across the world. And Canonical offered me the opportunity to be part of that and to see how that grew in the public sector. And the public sector in the discussions at the Cabinet Office recognised a number of challenges. And as I say, it wasn't easy at Canonical. We had those challenges across the board. And we had them because we were negotiating with risk managers. And by that I mean lawyers. I will confess I was one for 25 years. I don't know if you can ever stop being one. So maybe I'm still a bit of one. But lawyers, procurement people, and financiers. They were the risk managers and organisations, and they had between them the opportunity to block open source going into the enterprise 10, 15 years ago. they didn't understand open source in many cases. And what that meant was they did block open source going into the enterprise. Things are very, very different today. I think I heard you say 90%, Jim, when you were standing on a stage giving your keynote at the Linux Foundation event in Dublin. 90% of software today is open source. Certainly when we look at research, depending on the particular area it's in, we see 48 to 98% of software stacks being built on open source. So how have we gone from these difficult contracts to a situation today where we have such a scale of open source adoption, not just in the UK, but globally? I put it down to three things. I would say the key is digitalization, and every business has digitalized, whether it wanted to or not, and we've seen it at pace through the pandemic. The reluctant last adopters have shifted to a digital world, and that means that they have their products and services either created, distributed, or consumed using technology. And that means that they have it created, distributed, or consumed using software. We live in a software-defined world. And for a world to be software-defined, today it's defined in open source. There's just no escaping it. So that digitalization, these three things, what are they? So for me, the first is the elevated status of the developer, the engineer. And what we've seen is because of digitalization, those who run this technology are much more important than they've ever been. They have more authority, more control, more power in organizations, whether they're public or private sector, than they've ever had. So that elevated status allows them to make decisions that they would always have liked to have made. And if you ask most engineers, they want to use open source because it generally will give them the best software. So we see the shift with them having choice. The second thing that I think has made a huge difference is Git. Created in 2005 as a tool for developers, what Git does is allow, over the last decade, the evolution of GitLab, GitHub, and other repositories that distribute open source software. And by putting open source software in those environments, you facilitate those engineers with an elevated status to bring open source into their organizations and use it at scale. The third thing is inescapable, and it's platform and cloud. And we have seen this shift over to that kind of world, that platform cloud-based world. And as we all know in this room, I'm sure most of the infrastructure that sits below that, behind it, is open source. So for me, these three things are the keys to digitalization. And as citizens, these days, we receive our services, whether they're from businesses, whether they're from the public sector, we receive our services via apps and via technology. And then sitting at the back end within the enterprises, within the public sector, is that infrastructure. One thing that we see as a commonality across that open source software, whether it's created by individuals, companies, combinations of the two, one commonality is the licensing. So to be open source, it needs to be on an OSI approved license. And all of those OSI approved licenses will do something in common, and they disclaim liability. So what we have is a community over here creating open source code, a community that distributes on open source licensing, and over here we have the infrastructure. And somehow we have to move from here to here. Now, those using the code in the infrastructure are responsible because the engineers, the developers, the companies distributing code here, without exception, will be disclaiming liability. And the only thing that shifts that is economics. So laws and policies ought to reflect this user responsibility. And the user responsibility is rapidly becoming known as curation. And that's a bunch of different things. So that's technology and governance. Bring those together to create good hygiene around your technology and governance, whether that's in ensuring there's documentation, maintenance, that you have secure code. All of that sits as the responsibility of the user. And that's a big change. And whilst we've got to open source adoption at scale, we're still on a learning curve with that change. We're still explaining what that means and helping those who use to understand the responsibilities that they have. So hopefully that has given you some context which will help you to work through and contribute to the thought leadership work we're going to do today. And we're going to start with a couple of keynotes. The first from Lord Maud, Francis Maud, who was the Cabinet Minister responsible for that open source first strategy. We're then going to move to Jim Zemlin, who has played a significant part in the work that OpenSSF has been doing securing open source. And then we'll go to our first panel that will talk about infrastructure. I have an apology to share with you from Ashley Monagle, who is part of that first panel and unfortunately can't get here on time today. So we're going to have to go ahead in that first panel without Ashley. We'll then have a coffee break. We'll move to panels 3 and 4. Panel 3 will be led by Judy Parnell from the BBC, and it will focus on supply chain and software bill of materials. Panel 4 will be led by Dawn Foster of VMware, who's also an OpenUK board director. And Dawn will lead her panel through OSPOs and governance. We go into the lunch break. Following on from lunch, we'll have a discussion about the value of open source with Dr. Jennifer Barth, who is a research director at Symmetry and OpenUK's partner on our State of Open reports that I know some of you know and even one or two of you are fans of. And then we will hear from Dr. Rebecca Rumble, the executive director of the Rust Foundation. We'll have one more panel, which will look at security, led by another OpenUK director, Liz Rice, Chief Open Source Officer at Isovalent. We'll have an afternoon tea break and a final panel that will look on policy and funding. Now, each of the panels is 50 minutes or an hour long, and the last 10 minutes have been set aside in theory for your questions. When you have questions, you'll see these chairs have a mic between each of the two chairs that you can use to ask questions. My final thing to say to you is a piece of housekeeping about those mics and recording. So the day is being photographed and recorded. You all signed up to that on Eventbrite, whether you remember doing so or not. For anybody who doesn't remember doing so and isn't happy about that, if you want to move to the back row, we will make sure that the back row is not included in the recording. Also, there will be audience reaction shots as well as shots of you asking questions, so just so you're aware. Our photographer, Tiana, is going to arrive for the afternoon session. She's not here this morning. She's actually, thanks to the sponsorship of ARM, working with us on a photo shoot called State of Open. It's a recurring theme in the work we're doing. And State of Open is a photo shoot of 50 key figures in open source software, which will also be launched next spring. There's a lot going on next spring, so thanks very much to ARM for that sponsorship. Tiana is absolutely delightful. She's got a cold, so she'll be wearing a mask, but don't let that put you off approaching her. And she's going to take photos of groups and people participating in the event, as well as those speaking on stage.